Welcome to the Holistic Psychiatry Podcast. I'm Courtney Snyder, a physician, an adult and child holistic psychiatrist. In this podcast, I discuss cutting-edge research into the root causes of brain-related symptoms, alongside ancient understanding of health and well-being. From these left brain and right brain perspectives, I discuss interventions, tools, and mindsets that we can use not only to heal, but to thrive. To the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders. This is one of my favorite quotes by Lao Tzu. Again, it goes, "To the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders." If we are in the midst of stress, our body and our mind may too easily be going into fight, flight, or freeze. In this episode, I'll talk about how we can still our mind and our body in the middle of an acute stress response. And I'm not referring to stress that would come naturally from, for example, our house being on fire, where that stress response is completely appropriate and necessary. I'm talking about things like hurtful comments, an unsettling email, the anticipation of a presentation at work, an unsettling thought, or even a physical symptom that might be triggering for us. In the last episode, I mentioned that lowering stress is a powerful way to lower inflammation. I discussed how some of us appear to have a genetic predisposition that lowers our threshold for going into acute inflammation. This threshold can also be lowered by our early attachment experiences, trauma, toxicity, including EMF, or having unwelcome microbes on board. Each of these can leave the body, and secondarily the mind, in a chronic threat response. Whether it's primarily due to toxicity or life experiences, the tools I'm talking about can be helpful. Having said all that, as you listen to this episode, I'd encourage you to listen from an even bigger picture perspective. This is about going through our days and our lives with a greater sense of ease. That doesn't mean that we don't have stress. It means that we know how to work with it and how to even use it to our advantage. This isn't about being perfectly chilled out all the time. It's about knowing how to interrupt the stress response, how to raise that threshold in which we become stressed, and how to make meaning of the information that our body is giving us. So what is a trigger? Emotional triggers are automatic emotional responses. These occur more in our bodies actually than in our brains. To oversimplify, we have our prefrontal cortex, this is the thinking part of our brain, and we have the limbic system with the amygdala, which exist basically to gauge threat and to react quickly so that we can avoid danger. The amygdala doesn't have a lot of gradation. We are safe or we aren't safe. It can kick off our autonomic nervous system. And to remind you, there are two aspects to the autonomic nervous system. One is the sympathetic that puts us into fight or flight, and the other is the parasympathetic, which is largely mediated by the vagus nerve. And this puts us into rest and digest. We also have a part of the vagus or parasympathetic nervous system, which when we're perceiving a threat, or our body is, can put us into freeze or shutdown. So again, if we're triggered, we may go into fight, and so this could be anger. We may go into flight, which would be like an anxiety type of response, or freeze, where we literally check out and are immobilized. If you want to hear more about this particular topic of the autonomic nervous system, I have podcasts that relate to the vagus nerve as well as a blog post. Usually when we use the word trigger, we're talking about when the past is coming into the present. Because of previous experiences, something that is happening right now is considered threatening in some way. If we've had an authoritarian parent, we may go into a stress response when we're in the presence of a boss at work, however humble and relatable they may be. If we have a traumatic event involving a flood or a fire. We may be triggered by storms or the smell of smoke. If we have been assaulted or witnessed violence, it can be hard to watch TV without having that autonomic stress response. So what are some acute stressors? And again, I'm not talking about when our life or that of someone we know or see is in imminent danger. We should have a physiologic stress response there. However, there are other times when this stress response comes up, and I can come up with sort of 5 general categories. You may think of more. The first would be anticipated stress, and this might be public speaking, performance, or competitive events. Here we can learn from professional athletes and performers who don't deny stress, they work with it. There's also the kind of stress that comes out of the blue. Maybe we feel self-conscious in the moment of giving, for example, a presentation or some type of performance, or being on a date. Maybe we feel left out of a group or in our family or in the workplace setting, or we feel dismissed or discounted by a particular person. Maybe we feel like we're being controlled by someone, that someone is directly or indirectly trying to get us to do something, and we don't feel we have the freedom to say no. Maybe we're in a workplace setting that is very hierarchical, and we have a situation in which we don't feel we have a choice. Or maybe we're in a marriage that we don't feel that we have an equal say. Perhaps we feel someone is taking advantage of us, or someone is trying to manipulate us. Maybe it is feeling as if they are using indirect ways to get from us something that may be in their interest, but not in ours. Maybe we're in a relationship in which we can't breathe or fully step into ourselves. Or maybe we are in a relationship where we feel there is not a connection and we feel lonely. Maybe someone is violating our boundaries, our body, our personal space, our time. Maybe their comments show a lack of recognition that we are a separate person with our own preferences, wants, and needs. Maybe we are afraid of uncertainty and something we are counting on has changed all of a sudden. Maybe we are participating in something that we feel is wrong. Maybe we are being triggered by our own thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, we can also be triggered by our own symptoms. And if we've experienced trauma, we may be triggered by something sensory, a color that we see, a particular sound or a smell. Many of these things can be happening largely out of our conscious awareness. Another type of category when it comes to triggers would be when we feel disconnected or alone. We are all hardwired to connect. The feeling of disconnection by itself can activate the sympathetic nervous system, putting us into, again, a fight or flight response. This one is a little trickier to see. I know for myself, and I'm an introvert, so I get a lot of energy from alone time, but if I have too much time alone, I'm in my head too much, and then I notice that when I am with people, I do feel better. How can we interrupt the stress response so we're not going into fight, flight, or freeze? And with that, inflammation, including brain inflammation. How can we ground ourselves? And to me, this means how can we get into our body and out of our heads? And how can we get into the present moment? How can we shift our limbic and autonomic nervous system more quickly from a feeling of threat to a feeling of safety, while also using the good information we've just been given by our limbic system? Remember, this is where we pick up on things that our brains, our prefrontal cortex, simply can't. Before I talk about strategies for those stressors that come out of the blue, I'd like to comment on stress that comes as part of anticipation and what we can learn from performers and athletes. My 17-year-old daughter has me listening to Queen. I was a fan when I was her age, and recently she was showing me a video of Freddie Mercury and Roger Taylor getting ready to go on stage. And we easily take for granted that this is just what they do. but it's really not. They had to mentally and physically prepare for their concerts. They would sing loudly at each other. Singing loudly, interestingly, will access the vagus nerve. Singing does anyway, but when we sing very loudly, it especially does, and helps us move into that calm state. They would also jump up and down. Freddie would pump his arms in front of him and stretch his legs. And Freddie Mercury did talk openly about the nerves he had before going on stage, not with any sense of shame or thinking of it as an anxiety disorder or problem, but just part of his job, part of what he and the others had to work with. Athletes also anticipate high stress. To quote Taylor Clark, who wrote the book Nerve, and this is about how people deal best with fear, pressure, and stress, he says, studies from everyone from classical musicians to competitive swimmers have found no difference at all between elites and novices in the intensity of their pre-performance anxiety. The poised, top-flight performers, however, were far more likely to describe their fear as an aid to success than the non-elites. So great athletes work with their fear, they accept it, they don't argue with it, and they don't resist it. And just as with performers such as Queen, athletes also have to have the ability to modulate their degree of anxiety, or what sports psychologists would call arousal. They don't consider this a bad thing. In fact, if an athlete or performer doesn't have a healthy degree of arousal, they won't perform well. But to regulate this stress response requires a degree of body awareness. The athlete has to know when they are too aroused and when they are not aroused enough. Athletes think about how they feel in their body, they listen to their body, and this is something that we can all do. Choking in sports is when an athlete is unable to manage their anxiety or arousal. They're unable to cope with the demands of the moment, leading to a drop in their performance. They lose trust in themselves, they overthink, they start to analyze and focus on technique instead of trusting what at this point really should be automatic. Choking often comes after an athlete has made a mistake and they're unable to regain their composure, or I would say they're unable to get back into the present moment. Many athletes will also use imagery. They will imagine what it will feel like to go through the physical motions, and even add some unexpected elements to their imagery to help them be able to regain composure. They're essentially strengthening the pathways that are used when doing what they intend to do. So I've talked about anticipated stress, usually the kind that we are signing up for, essentially. But what about out of the blue triggers? First, I would say we can grow an awareness of how we feel in our bodies, just as those athletes do. Think of the last time you were triggered and experiencing an acute stress response. If you are physically aware, it may have felt like a squirt of adrenaline. Maybe you had a tight stomach, tension in your neck or shoulders, or a slight headache. I know I was a latecomer when it came to listening to my body. We can't know what we don't know. I had a great therapist once who every time I expressed a feeling, she would lean in and quickly ask, "Where did you feel that?" Every time. I still ask myself that now. At first, I thought it was a bit strange, but it really helped me notice all the good information that my body was sharing with me. It even made me less at odds with my body. Remember that just as our body can throw us into a state of fight, flight, or freeze, it is also the place where we can go to access calm. Grounding is a way we get back into the present moment and back into our bodies. It's often talked about with PTSD, panic, or disassociation or depression, but we can all benefit from understanding grounding. As I talk about these tools, listen to what resonates with you. You don't want to use all these tools, and if you did use all these tools, you would be countering any benefits. So just listen to what gets your attention, what sounds interesting or fitting for you. My own preference is to use the body as opposed to the mind to interrupt the stress response and really return it to a state of safety. However, there are ways to use the mind, and certainly you can use both together. Sometimes when we're experiencing stress, we're by ourselves, and we can use these tools to manage our stress. And sometimes we're in situations with someone else. And know that we can always excuse ourselves if we're finding a stress response is coming on, and we can collect ourselves and then return to that conversation when and if we want, and when we are ready, or not at all. That could be appropriate in some circumstances. So to get on with the tools, there are physical things we can do. We can notice our breathing, which is so easy and so powerful. And we can do, if we're alone, block breathing. And this is where you breathe in on 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, breathe out on 4 counts, and then leave your breath out on 4 counts. And you just repeat that. We can tap into our senses and notice what is going on around us. Listen for sounds. Notice the colors around us. Do we smell anything? What do we feel? For example, do we feel our clothes against our body, or our back against the chair, or our feet on the ground? We can shift our vision, and this is one that's easy, and you won't see it referenced very much, but I think it's very powerful. And this is where we simply open our visual field. We can focus on things, but when we try to look at, for example, the whole room or the whole horizon in front of us, that actually creates a physiologic shift. We can move, we can walk, jump, stretch, and again, if we have to, we can walk away and give ourselves permission to say, hey, I need to take a break here. There are mental things we can do to interrupt the stress response. You can count backwards. You can describe your surroundings, which go along with the sensory awareness that I mentioned above. For example, I'm Courtney Snyder. I live in Kentucky. Today is September 30th, and it is afternoon and the sun is out. I'm sitting at my desk and I'm recording a podcast. If this all is sounding like mindfulness, it is. Mindfulness is the ability to be in the moment with awareness and without judgment. When we are mindful, there is no past or future. There is no inner critic or judge. There is just an awareness of this moment. So if we are practicing mindfulness and making a point to stop here and there to be present, we can build this muscle that makes us more resistant to the stress response. But again, this is a tool we could employ in the moment when we are stressed also. We could recite a song or a poem or a prayer, something that makes us feel at peace or not. I think if we can double dip on some of these things, it helps. So we might sing or hum a song that is meaningful. I like the song Let It Be. I also like the song Hallelujah, which makes me think about this idea of radical gratitude. The idea that we can have gratitude even in our toughest times, and that we can even have gratitude for our most painful feelings. We can watch a video that puts our thoughts elsewhere, but also gets us laughing, which accesses the vagus nerve. We can use imagery. Maybe there's someone we know who is particularly grounded and has embodied this idea of stillness. I like imagining a heron, as I really appreciate the image of a heron standing still at a shoreline. And if we are able, we can pull back mentally and look at what the bigger picture is. What really matters in this situation? Is it the point we're trying to make, or is it the relationship? We will never become completely unflappable, but I think having such words in our pocket can be helpful. Other words that might bring a degree of centering could be composed, self-possessed, unruffled, collected, cool. But more physically, we might say that we are grounded or still, meaning not fighting, not fleeing, and not freezing. And it is in this grounded stillness that we really can have a sense of dignity and self-respect. There are also nurturing strategies, self-talk. It's usually our inner child that is getting angry or scared. We can talk to that part of ourself in a nurturing voice or inner voice from another part of ourself. That other part can be a loving and compassionate parent that knows how to bring a sense of calm and safety to that inner child. We don't have to have had a parent who was like this to be able to benefit from this tool. Maybe we knew someone who was kind and compassionate. And as strange as it may sound, we can even hug ourselves. We can cross our arms, place our palms on our shoulders, and stroke our arms downward to our elbows and repeat this. While doing this, we can recite a simple mantra. And, a mantra that I like, and this comes out of listening to Tosha Silver, who is a spiritual teacher. She says, breathe in calming, quieting energy, and breathe out whatever wants to go. By doing this, we are providing not only nurturing, but touch. We're also feeling because our hands are stroking our arms. And again, we're providing nurturing comments for that, as I would say, inner child. But on a technical level, what we're doing is calming the amygdala, and that is putting us more into that parasympathetic or rest and digest state. It is also boosting oxytocin, a hormone that is conjured up by human touch and bonding. So as I mentioned the science, I'm having images of listeners like myself who, now having heard the science, are starting to cross their arms and breathe in calming, quieting energy and breathing out whatever wants to go. Another one that I like is hand washing, which kind of fits with this. We have a lot of sensory neurons in our hands, and washing our hands can be a very nurturing and sensory experience. And if we're mindful as we're doing it as to why we're doing it, that intention can put us in a calm state. So there are endless ideas, and if you have one you want to share, please do so on the social media sites for me and other people that are listening. So keys to remember on interrupting the stress response is do it right away, and don't have too many tools such that you can't remember what to do, or you think things have to be done a certain way. You don't want to be perfectionistic about any of this. And do it regularly, despite there being genetic components to how cool-headed or composed we are in the midst of stress, and I would say methylation is part of this. How poised we are is the result of what we do on a daily basis to build up this ability and this temperament. There was a twin study that suggests that genes account for around 30% of our anxiousness. So we have 70% to work with. Much of what I've talked about are tools that we can use in the moment, and again, if done regularly, can retrain our nervous system. However, there are other ways, and I would call these daily practices, that are also aimed at retraining our nervous system. The first would be to try to understand why some triggers are actually triggering for us. For example, if I'm saying something and feel that I'm not being listened to and then react disproportionately, it would be worth my reflecting on that. What was that about? What are the factors in the past fueling some of that? Maybe I need to unearth where that comes from. Maybe there are larger ways I'm feeling discounted in this group or in this relationship. So if we just have some curiosity, and I would say humility, because it is much easier to blame than to self-reflect, then we can often disempower some of our unconscious perceptions that will sneak up on us at times. To me, the phrase, know thyself, is what this is all about. We need to know our buttons, know what situations, comments, types of people, types of relationships we may be finding ourselves reacting in. This can help turn some of our out-of-the-blue stressors into anticipated ones, and it can also help bring clarity to those people and situations we want in our life. It doesn't matter how evolved we think we are, we can still carry within us experiences that shape our perception. We all still have buttons. It's just when we think we don't that we get blindsided. Another more general practice is to have self-compassion. It's hard enough to experience a stress response, but then worse if we beat ourselves up because of it. There are times in relationships when certainly an apology is called for. Perhaps we said or did things that were hurtful. We need to apologize not just out of respect for that person, but also for ourselves to restore our dignity. And I would say apologizing, certainly when appropriate, is a way of grounding. When we go into denial and try to forget or ignore or convince ourselves that the other person deserves whatever happened, that only makes things worse, not just for the relationship, but for our own well-being. So again, we can try to make sense of how the past may be coming into the present, and we can have compassion for ourselves, and we can make use of the information. While the information may relate to the past, it could also relate to something very practical. For example, is this a situation where we need to set a boundary? Are we overextending ourselves? Recently, I had made a mistake, and I could have spent the rest of the week ruminating about it, kicking myself, or I could say, what does this moment have to offer? How can this be a turning point? How can this lead to needed change? You might call it a wake-up call. In my case, the wake-up call was related to the fact that I had been overextending myself, not setting a limit on something someone had asked me to do. Instead, it became something I was grateful for and has led me to further shore up my boundaries and the limits that I want to set with others so that I can be healthier, happier, and of better service. Study after study shows that those who function well under stress see times of change and uncertainty as opportunities. They focus on what they can do to improve stressful situations, and they stay engaged with the world around them instead of withdrawing. This is exactly why the U.S. Army puts all of its soldiers through stress resilience courses, and that studies show students that have been educated in this area of stress resilience get higher GPAs. And I can't talk about lowering the stress response without commenting on the need to learn not to cling to certainty. And I do have a podcast on this topic, but I would just say here that if we can learn to let go of a need for certainty, then we're much less likely to get stressed when things are going in a different direction than we expect. Also, if we're able to make meaning of difficult situations, that also makes a huge difference. And I have a podcast on meaning making as well. To quote Serena Williams, if you just go out there and not be afraid of the negative results, you'll be surprised. You might even get a positive result. So here again is an athlete that has been obviously quite successful, and she approaches the game as if there's no certainty that things may not go her way, and she's not afraid of that. So I've commented on athletes and performers, but this also applies to some of history's great leaders. Nancy Cohen, a professor of Harvard's Business School, has written the book Forged in Crisis, and she would say that like athletes and performers, great leaders don't ignore or aim to eliminate anxiety. They are all fairly comfortable with uncertainty. She describes the missions of various leaders as being crystal clear, despite not knowing exactly how they would get there. To quote the author, You need to nurture a new way of thinking about the crisis among your people. Pull them away from believing there is a clear GPS-like path to its end. They recognize the need to take one smaller challenge at a time while still seeing the big picture. While this podcast has been about how to lower the acute stress response, know that anything that we do to generally lower our stress is going to lower that threshold with which we go into an acute stress response. So meditation is something that would absolutely be beneficial here, and I'll do an episode in the future specifically on meditation. There are a number of therapies that can be helpful. The most well-known is EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. There are also somatic therapies and a number of other trauma-based therapies. While I'm offering a number of ideas in terms of how we can ground ourselves, these aren't a replacement for psychotherapies that can help when someone has more severe symptoms. To close, I would say that we are all in a different place with this and have different contributing factors to our stress response. Wherever we are at, we can practice. Again, this doesn't mean we don't have fear or anger or irritation. It means we accept these feelings and can interrupt the stress response and stay grounded and connected to ourselves and in the moment. Be compassionate with yourself. Don't beat yourself up. Don't create another stress response. And then don't beat yourself up for not being compassionate enough with yourself either. There is no perfection here. We are all stumbling along, and hopefully we keep picking ourselves up. And as we are dusting ourselves off, we can even say something kind and encouraging. Regardless of the health benefits and the lowering of inflammation, remember that our life can be distilled down to these moments. We can see our challenging moments as opportunities. To end with a quote by the golfer Annika Sorenstam, "You've got to learn how to throw bad shots out and stand over the next shot and say, okay, this is the most important shot. I always call it the now shot. The shot you are hitting now is the most important. 10 minutes ago is irrelevant, and who knows what's going to happen in another 10 minutes. To be notified of upcoming episodes, please consider subscribing at CourtneySnyderMD.com, where I also have blog posts related to the root causes of brain-related symptoms. If you'd like to help me get this information out into the world, please consider liking, sharing, or commenting on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. I look forward to connecting with you in a future podcast. Until then, take care.